Bible community, this is Tommy and welcome to another musical adventure. I want to take time to thank everybody that subscribed to the channel. If you haven't done so, please do it. I know you get tired of every YouTube channel and every YouTuber saying, subscribe, subscribe, like. So I'm just going to say it once right at the beginning of the video. Like and subscribe. I'm inching ever so closely to 1,000 subscribers. Get the word out, please. I enjoy doing these videos. And whether I have 10 subscribers or 10,000 subscribers, I'm still going to make the videos. But I hope you enjoy what we're doing. So this week, in honor of the 80th birthday, that's right, 80th birthday of Bob Dylan. Yesterday was May 24th, 2021, and it was Bob Dylan's birthday. So what I want to do is look at the albums that Bob Dylan did in the 80s. Bob Dylan at 80 in the 80s. And so I'm going to briefly kind of go through his output. And here's the thing, a lot of great artists struggled in the 80s. I made a comment recently that had Dylan never written another song after 1966, he would be considered one of the greatest songwriters of all time. He revolutionized music, he revolutionized songwriting. That's not hyperbole, that is the absolute truth. And everyone that knows Dylan, they know that. And so you look at his 60s output, revolutionary, game changer. He switched gears, kind of did something else. And Dylan's always kind of been known to do that, to kind of keep people on their toes. Even at 80, last year Bob Dylan released one of his strongest albums. Dylan is not down and out by no means, and I don't expect him to be. And every time you think Dylan's down and out, he comes back and surprises you with a really great album. The 80s is no exception. Now, I'll say this. I think the 80s were rough on a lot of great artists from the 60s. Paul McCartney, he didn't have a great decade in the 80s. Neil Young didn't have a great decade in the 80s. A lot of the Rolling Stones, there were a lot of iconic acts that throughout the 80s, to me, they kind of lost their way. Are they gone, down and out? No, they're still around. Every one of those artists are still around. So Dylan, still around. Happy birthday, Bob Dylan. 80 years. Incredible. So let's really quickly, we're going to go through his 80s output. Now we're going to start with 1979 because I feel like this is the best place to start with Dylan in the 80s. Slow Train Coming, recorded at the Muscle Shoals in Alabama with the Muscle Shoals rhythm section, Barry Beckett, Mark Knopfler playing guitar. This is when Dylan shocked the entire world, became a born-again Christian, and started writing and recording gospel music. That's right, Bob Dylan was making music about his Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, and Slow Train Coming was the first one. Now, a lot of people didn't know how to take it. There's a lot of fire and brimstone on this album. To me, Dylan's gospel output, as it were, in their 3 albums, has undergone a bit of a sort of reevaluation critically. Some people have kind of, at the time, that were confounded by this music, have gone back and softened their stance and said, you know what? It's really not that bad. This album, to me, is a fantastic album, and it's got some highly underrated Dylan material. Songs like Precious Angel, the title track, Slow Train Coming, and Gotta Serve Somebody. All 3, to me, are just fantastic Bob Dylan songs. But there is a lot of fire and brimstone on Slow Train Coming. So if that's not your cup of tea, and I understand that it wouldn't be, he followed it up in 1980 and kicked the decade off right with Saved. That's right, Saved. This is another gospel record. Now, whereas Slow Train Coming, to me, was more of a sort of fire and brimstone, hellfire kind of album, this is more like praise and worship. Bob Dylan was still singing about Jesus, but songs like Solid Rock, Are You Ready, Covenant Woman, those are all fantastic songs, but it's got a bit of a happier feel. Still recorded with that great rhythm section. Dylan's gospel records, like I said, if you've not checked it out or are a little afraid to, I say give it a shot. You never know. Now, easily, and I won't say this is the best gospel record because I like all 3 of the gospel records pretty equally, but this one is probably the most rocking, and it does sort of come out of more of the preachy, sort of Jesus-y stuff. Shot of Love from 1981. Of course, Dylan's still a Christian, still singing about Jesus. Songs like Property of Jesus and Shot of Love, the title track, Heart of Mine. All very gospel songs, but it also has songs like Lenny Bruce, where he's singing about the comedy legend. So they're not all overtly sort of gospel songs. This also features, to me, one of Bob Dylan's greatest songs, Every Grain of Sand. Now, one of the things about Dylan, to me, is that even on his worst albums, you still can find a great song, maybe two. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But I guess if you're kind of a little antsy about the Dylan gospel period, I might suggest starting with Shot of Love. Now, the production's really big. It's in your face, which some people don't like, and I understand that. But I think as far as just an album that you can sort of take in, this is the one to get. Now, I will say this. There was a song, The Groom Still Waiting at the Altar, which is, to me, a fantastic Bob Dylan rocker. It wasn't on the original pressings of this album. So look for that track, because some of the later pressings, they added it, and it's a great song, The Groom Still Waiting at the Altar. So 1983 saw Dylan sort of coming out of the gospel period, and he released Infidels. Now, this album is less gospel and more political. Songs like Joker Man, License to Kill, Neighborhood Bully, Union Sundown, all sort of overtly talking about the political situation in the Middle East. Dylan was sort of making indirect sort of commentary on that, like Dylan does. Dylan's never going to come out usually and say something unless you get to the early period. But by this point, Dylan had kind of mastered the art of finesse and mystery. And so this album is definitely there. Now, he was recording with Mark Knopfler at this point, and some people say this is one of Dylan's best albums of the 80s. I'm inclined to agree. Infidels is sort of classic Dylan, the great wordplay, just the sort of poetic songwriting. It's all here. Now, also I'll say this about Dylan on Infidels. He's sort of going into the sort of Dylan sort of parody voice. When people imitate Bob Dylan or give me that age-old thing, Bob Dylan can't sing, which I'm really kind of overhearing. This is what they're imitating, is the way Dylan sounds, that nasally kind of thing that Bob Dylan does. Yeah, there's a little bit of that on this album. But as an album, a collection of songs, Infidels, absolutely strong. He toured England in the early 80s. In 1984, he released a live album. Now, he worked with Glenn Johns, hard rock producer, worked with some sort of heavy hitters. It's a pretty standard live album. I mean, reworkings of some songs. He rewrote Tangled Up in Blue, so there's some new lyrics on that. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it. It's a live album. It's not essential for Dylan completists only. Now, here's where things start to really go a little haywire for me. 1985, Bob Dylan, Empire Burlesque. Look at that cover. Bob looks very 80s there. Now, some Dylan fans have been inclined to call this album Disco Dylan because of the production. I'm hard-pressed to call it disco. I wouldn't say it's a disco album, by no means. But it is a little strange to hear Bob Dylan sort of awash in 80s sort of production. Like I said, it's not a disco album. However, there are some songs on here. Tight Connection to My Heart, which is really good. Emotionally Yours, and Dark Eyes are all really good Dylan songs. Are they essential Dylan songs? Maybe not. But I will say, and sorry for fans of this album, it's a head scratcher. And I mean, fans of Dylan probably bought this and put it on and thought, what's going on with Bob? Well, he didn't help himself. Usually when Dylan would make like a really sort of strange album or something that was of left field, for example, Self-Portrait in the early 70s, he would follow it up with something probably a little bit stronger like New Morning. He didn't do so in the 80s. He kind of doubled down, and he followed it up with 1986's Knocked Out Loaded. Now, Dylan was touring with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers at this time. To give you an idea about Knocked Out Loaded, this is the only steel-sealed Bob Dylan album I have in my collection. Now, that's not to say I won't ever open it, but I've never had a desire to like spin this album on vinyl, which is a shame. It's not good. Now, Dylan fans, and I will agree, will point out Brownsville Girl, co-written with Sam Shepard, as a particularly strong song, and it is. But one song does not an album make, and Knocked Out Loaded, to me, is an abysmal Bob Dylan album. Followed on the heels of Empire Burlesque, I'm sure back in that time, a lot of Dylan fans were sort of going, what happened? What's going on? What's Dylan doing? He's touring with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. He toured with the Grateful Dead. I think Dylan was trying to re-find himself in some ways, and I think he's admitted as much in his book Chronicles, which, by the way, Chronicles, his autobiography, Volume 1, he kind of talks about that a little bit and talks about that period, about how he was a little bit lost and was really not sure of himself anymore. He lost confidence in himself. Now, he did tour with the Grateful Dead. This is the album that came out, the live show. It's Dylan and the Dead. I wish I could tell you guys that Bob Dylan and the Grateful Dead produced this amazing material that was unsurpassed. You would think these great sort of 60s icons would have done something amazing. I can't say that that's true. Dylan does some pretty standard workouts. And I want to show you this. This was the Record Store Day release on that tie-dye vinyl. He does a couple of his gospel songs like Gotta Serve Somebody and Slow Train Coming. Also some of his 60s songs like I Want You, Knocking on Heaven's Door. It's not terrible. It's okay. It didn't do anything to sort of re-establish Bob Dylan as the great artist that he is. And so, amidst all of that, Dylan was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 1988, and he released this. Knocked Out, Down in the Groove. I'm getting them confused with Knocked Out Loaded. Down in the Groove. I spun this album recently. It's I might say it's the worst Bob Dylan album. If you're a fan of this album, comment down below, defend it. But yeah, okay, Silvio's a good song. I like it. But the rest of the album, not so good. I mean, it's a bad album. It does feature Randy Jackson, and Kip Winger of Winger fame plays on this album. This is where I think probably a lot of people jumped off the ship, and rightfully so. And so again, going back to Chronicles, he talks about this period and about how he was struggling to find himself. And so I think Dylan knew that he was on real shaky ground, and again, having the confidence in his abilities as a writer. So he teamed up with Daniel Lanois, went down to New Orleans in a huge mansion, and recorded Oh Mercy. Now, fans of Infidels, I'm sorry. I think Infidels is a great album, but I think Oh Mercy is a fantastic album. 1989, this album puts Dylan, to me, back in Bob Dylan territory. Strong songs like Political World, Ring Them Bells, Everything Is Broken, What Good Am I Most of the Time, Shooting Star. This album is classic. It's sort of dressed in that Daniel Lanois atmospheric, sort of, echoey production. Really, really strong set of songs. And Oh Mercy, to me, is an album that, for anyone that was losing faith in Bob Dylan, this album restored it. And Bob Dylan ended the 80s with a strong album. And I would even go so far as to say, this is not only one of Dylan's strongest albums of the 80s, but it's probably one of Dylan's strongest albums of all time. Oh Mercy. It's fantastic, Dylan. And we're going to finish the 80s with 1990, Under the Red Sky. This was produced by Don Was. Now, if Oh Mercy put Dylan back on the map or reestablished him as sort of the great songwriter of his time, this is one of those albums, I think, when it came out, it was kind of simplistic with songs like TV Talking Song, Wiggle Wiggle. A lot of people didn't know how to take it. It was kind of simplistic lyrics. The music was very basic. It's kind of undergone a little bit of some of that reevaluation, like most of Dylan's stuff. I wouldn't say it's one of his strongest albums. It certainly, to me, isn't as worthy a follow-up to Oh Mercy as it probably should have been. But it's okay. It's an okay album. But that is Bob Dylan in the 80s. Now, Dylan, there's a lot of people with opinions on Bob Dylan. I want to know what you think. Was I just way off on these albums, or was I spot on, or what do you think? Is Down in the Groove as lousy as I say it is? For him to release one of his worst albums ever he also released one of his best albums ever. And that's Bob Dylan. That's what he does all the time, shifting gears, changing things up, and keeping his fans on their toes. Happy birthday, Bob Dylan. I think you're great. As a fan, I'm always going to follow whatever it is you're doing. I'm glad you're still doing it. I'll see you out on the road, headed for another joint. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and save the Texas Prairie Chicken.